Okay, so today we're going to be talking about evolution still. We're looking at evidence for evolution, and our focus is going to be on molecular biology. When we say molecular biology, we're really talking about DNA. So all that information that you learned back in your DNA unit, it's going to come into play now. So we're looking at evidence for evolution, and our focus is on molecular biology. Our learning goal, the one we're working on now, is the one at the very top. Explain how the scientific theory of evolution is supported by the fossil record, comparative anatomy, comparative embryology, biogeography, molecular biology, that's the one we're doing today, and observed evolutionary change. So we've gotten through most of this list. We have a couple more we're going to do tomorrow, but we'll just remain focused on where we are right now, which is molecular biology. Okay, now as we continue to go through this unit, I just want to keep reminding you that the evidence for evolution from all these different scientific fields all brings us to the same conclusions. Those conclusions that we draw from this evidence are that all living organisms have a common ancestor. Therefore, all living organisms are related. The more similar organisms are, the more closely related they are, and usually we're talking about DNA evidence on that one. And organisms have traits that make them well suited to their environment. So that's talking about how organisms change or populations change over time. Looking at our list of scientific evidence for evolution, we have the fossil record, which we've already done, comparative anatomy, comparative embryology, which we're doing later, biogeography, which we've already done, molecular biology, which is the focus for today. And then on day one, when we started this, we did observed evolutionary change, and we looked at the examples of the peppered moths and the antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Okay, so let's take a look at molecular biology and see how that provides evidence for evolution. Molecular biology, remember, is essentially information about DNA. And we did a unit about DNA where we talked about how the information in DNA was used to make proteins. So the information stored in DNA is used to make RNA, is used to make proteins. Those processes are transcription followed by translation. Now, what's really interesting about this, remember, is that all living organisms do this the same way. They store information in DNA, they transcribe that information to RNA, and they use RNA to make their proteins. They use the same nucleotides, A, T, C, and G, in their DNA, and the codons that code for the amino acids are the same. So this whole DNA and gene expression ties all living organisms together. Okay? Now, I want you to think about that big picture. In a previous unit, we talked about biotechnology, and we talked about DNA fingerprinting, where you could compare DNA from individuals and see how closely related they are. The more similar their DNA, the more closely related they are. Think about that on a species scale. The more similar the DNA, the more closely related the species are. So studying molecular biology, we're looking at gene structures and even chromosomal structures. We're looking at sequences of DNA, how that information is made into a protein. So we're also looking at proteins and comparing those structures. So we can see a lot of similarity between species based on their DNA sequence or their genetic makeup. All right, let's see how we can use that. So talking about how we're going to use this evidence from molecular biology to show relationships between species, we can just look at the similarity of the DNA. Humans, see, recognize the human in the middle of the picture there. Humans have 98% of our DNA sequences in common with chimps. 92% in common with mice. 26% of our DNA is the same as the DNA you find in a yeast cell. Yeast is the small microorganisms that make bread rise. We are 26% similar to them. So, I mean, it's fascinating that all living organisms share similar DNA sequences. That's how we recognize that all living organisms are related. Let's take a look at an example. So in this particular example, we have organisms A, B, C, and D. And we want to see how closely related they are. Well, if you're looking at A and B, there's 97% DNA similarity. If you're looking at A and C, you're looking at 85%. And if you're looking at A and D, you're looking at 50% similar DNA. Just looking at that table, you go, oh, well, the pair that has 98% of their DNA similar is the pair that's most closely related. That's what that tells you. The pair that has the least similarity in their DNA, A and D, that's the pair that is the least related. Now, they still have 50% of their DNA in common, so they're still related, but they're not related as closely. Okay, these are the kinds of problems you're going to have to look at. Piece of cake. Okay, and finally, just to remind you, if we're talking about molecular biology is talking about the study of DNA and how it's expressed in cells. So we know that species that have more DNA in common are more closely related. And you have to remember that all living organisms share some of those DNA sequences. That's what ties all living organisms together.